In 1865, the chains of slavery were broken, and for a brief moment, freedom seemed within reach. Families who had endured generations of forced labor dared to hope for a new beginning. Yet, as the dust of the Civil War settled, another system quietly took its place, one that did not rely on whips and auction blocks, but on laws, signs, and silent rules that dictated every movement of life. This system came to be known as Jim Crow, and it was built to remind an entire people that their freedom was conditional, fragile, and constantly under threat. Imagine walking into a train station only to see two waiting rooms, one labeled white and another colored. Imagine knowing that your children's schoolbooks would always be old, worn, and missing pages, while schools across town shined with new desks and polished floors. The rules of Jim Crow seeped into every corner of society, creating a world where the promise of equality was replaced by the reality of separation and humiliation. But the cruelty of this system wasn't just about dividing spaces. It was about controlling dignity, silencing voices, and limiting dreams. The right to vote, once celebrated as a pathway to change, was taken away through clever tricks like literacy tests and poll taxes, methods designed to make participation impossible. Courtrooms, where justice should stand tall, became arenas where fairness was denied, and verdicts were already decided before a word was spoken. Even worse, the shadow of violence loomed everywhere. Communities that dared to prosper often faced destruction, and those who resisted the invisible lines of segregation risked brutal consequences. It was a time when progress felt dangerous, and survival often meant silence. And yet, despite this, people endured. They built churches, schools, and businesses. They created music, art, and traditions that carried hope through the darkest of days. Their resilience was not just resistance, it was a declaration that no law, no matter how oppressive, could extinguish the human spirit. The story of Jim Crow is not only about injustice, it is about the strength of a community that refused to be erased. It is about how laws can shape lives, but courage can shape history. Today, as we look back on this era, we are reminded that the fight for equality did not end with emancipation, it carried on through decades of struggle and sacrifice. If you believe stories like this must be remembered, if you want to uncover more hidden chapters of history that shaped the world we live in today, then I invite you to join us. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about truth and history. Together, we can make sure these stories are never forgotten. In the late 19th century, America stood at a crossroads. The Civil War had ended decades earlier, and the nation claimed to be moving toward equality. On paper, freedom was promised. But in reality, a new system was being built, one that would legally sanction division and deepen the wounds of inequality. The turning point came in 1896 with a case known as Plessy v. Ferguson. The story began in Louisiana, where a man named Homer Plessy challenged a law that forced him to sit in a separate railroad car because of his mixed ancestry. He believed, as many did, that freedom meant the ability to sit wherever he wished, to travel without restrictions, to live as a full citizen. His act of defiance was small but symbolic, a simple refusal to accept separation as the law of the land. Yet when the case reached the highest court in the nation, the decision would alter the course of history for generations. The Supreme Court ruled against Plessy, declaring that segregation was legal as long as the facilities provided for both groups were equal. It was a phrase that sounded balanced, almost harmless. But beneath those words lay a devastating reality. This ruling did not merely separate, it sanctioned inequality, cloaking it in the language of fairness. From that moment, the phrase, separate but equal, became the foundation of public life across the South. Yet nothing about it was equal. Schoolhouses for black children were often no more than wooden shacks, with leaking roofs and broken desks. The textbooks were hand-me-downs, their pages worn and outdated, while schools reserved for white children gleamed with fresh supplies and modern classrooms. Hospitals told a similar story: equipment was scarce, conditions unsafe, and the most basic care often denied, while across-town facilities shined with the promise of modern medicine. The inequality stretched far beyond education and healthcare. Public parks, transportation, restaurants, and even libraries were divided. A family might walk through town and see signs at every turn, where they could eat, where they could sit, even which water fountain they could use. Each sign was a reminder that the law itself had declared them second-class citizens. And if anyone dared to question or defy these rules, punishment came swiftly, sometimes through the courts, other times through violence. What made this ruling so insidious was that it gave prejudice the force of legitimacy. Ordinary citizens could point to the law and say, "This is how it must be." Teachers, judges, shopkeepers, and policemen all carried out segregation with a sense of righteousness, because the highest court in the land had told them it was just. The impact on everyday life was profound. A child growing up under these laws quickly learned that opportunity was not the same for everyone. Dreams of becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher were stifled by the lack of resources and access. Travel, something as simple as boarding a bus or buying a train ticket, was loaded with unspoken rules about where one could sit and how one should behave. Even leisure, something as small as a family trip to the movies, became a lesson in exclusion, with balconies reserved for some and plush seats reserved for others. Yet despite the weight of the ruling, people resisted in quiet and powerful ways. Families formed close communities, supporting one another through churches, schools, and local businesses. They built cultural movements in music, literature, and art that transcended the walls segregation tried to build. Jazz flowed from neighborhoods the law tried to diminish, poetry was written in voices the law tried to silence, and resilience became the answer to a system designed to suppress. The injustice of Plessy versus Ferguson lingered for more than half a century. It was not until 1954, in the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education, that the doctrine of separate but equal was finally struck down. But by then, generations had lived and suffered under the weight of a decision that legalized inequality. The scars it left behind were deep, visible not only in institutions, but in the psyche of a nation still struggling with the meaning of freedom. Looking back, Plessy versus Ferguson was more than a court case, it was a turning point that defined an era. It proved that laws could shape lives, not only by what they allowed but by what they denied. It showed how a single ruling could ripple outward, affecting schools, hospitals, neighborhoods, and families in ways that lasted for decades. And it serves as a reminder that justice delayed can often feel like justice denied. The story of Plessy versus Ferguson is not only about a legal decision, it is about the lived experiences of millions of people who navigated a world built on inequality disguised as fairness. It is a story of endurance, of voices silenced yet never extinguished, and of a nation grappling with the consequences of its own contradictions. And even today, its lessons remain urgent. Equality is not simply declared, it must be lived, protected, and fought for. The history of separate but equal reminds us how fragile justice can be, and how important it is to ensure that no law ever again places dignity on one side and denial on the other. After the Civil War, when freedom was finally written into law, there was hope that political power would follow. The right to vote meant more than a ballot, it was a voice, a chance to shape the future, and a pathway to dignity. In the early years after emancipation, newly enfranchised citizens stepped into polling stations with determination. Communities that had once been silenced now sent representatives to local councils, state legislatures, and even to Congress. For a brief time, democracy in America looked closer to its promise. But this moment was short-lived. Those who had long controlled the levers of power saw change as a threat. And so, they devised a strategy, not through open defiance, but through laws that seemed neutral on the surface, yet carried devastating consequences. Voting would no longer be a simple act of citizenship. It would become an obstacle course designed to exclude. The first barrier came in the form of poll taxes. On election day, before casting a vote, one had to pay a fee. For many, this was more than a mere inconvenience. It was a wall. Families struggling to put food on the table could not afford the cost of participation. Year after year, the unpaid fees stacked higher, until the price of a single vote became impossible to pay. The message was clear, the ballot was not meant for everyone. Then came literacy tests, another clever disguise. On paper, they were presented as a way to ensure voters were informed. In practice, they became tools of exclusion. Imagine standing before an election official who could ask you to read and interpret a random passage from the state constitution or to recite complex legal jargon. Even those who could read fluently found themselves failing, because the tests were never meant to be passed. The questions could be twisted, the answers dismissed. One person might be asked to spell a simple word, another might be asked to explain obscure clauses in law. The outcome depended not on knowledge, but on who you were. And then, the so-called grandfather clauses sealed the trap. These laws declared that if your grandfather had been eligible to vote, you were exempt from literacy tests or poll taxes. For many, this meant an easy path to the ballot box. But for those whose ancestors had been denied citizenship for centuries, the clause was a closed door. History itself became a barrier, ensuring that the descendants of those once excluded would remain excluded still. Together, these measures accomplished what violence alone could not. They drained the power from entire communities without firing a shot. In some states, voter registration among black citizens plummeted by more than 90%. Where once there had been vibrant participation, now silence took its place. Political offices that had briefly reflected diversity returned to being controlled by a single group, and laws were written without the voices of those most affected. The tragedy of these barriers was not only the loss of votes but the loss of faith. People who had once believed in the promise of democracy began to see the system as rigged against them. Each trip to the courthouse, each attempt to pay an impossible fee, each failed test administered in bad faith chipped away at hope. Generations grew up watching their parents turned away from polling stations, learning that their voices did not carry weight in the society around them. Yet despite this, resilience endured. Churches and community groups became centers of education and empowerment. Families taught one another to read, not simply for personal growth but as an act of resistance. Activists worked tirelessly to challenge unjust laws, often at great personal risk. They understood that power was not given freely, it had to be claimed, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles. The struggle stretched on for decades. It took marches, protests, and countless acts of courage to break the chains of these restrictions. The civil rights movement of the 20th century finally brought change, as new laws were passed to protect the right to vote. But the scars of disenfranchisement lingered, reminding the nation of the cost of exclusion. Looking back, the story of poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses is not just about laws. It is about the calculated effort to silence voices and the extraordinary resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. It shows how fragile democracy can be when fairness is undermined, and how easily power can be tilted by rules that seem harmless on the surface but cut deeply in practice. This chapter of history reminds us that the right to vote has never been guaranteed, it has always been fought for. And it challenges us to remain vigilant, to ensure that no law, no test, no hidden clause ever again takes away the power of the people to shape their own future. In the years following the Civil War, the courtroom should have been a place where justice reigned, where truth mattered more than prejudice, and where every citizen could stand as an equal before the law. But for many, that promise was hollow. Inside those walls, justice was not blind, it often turned its gaze away. Imagine stepping into a courthouse at the turn of the 20th century. The floors creak beneath heavy boots, the air hangs thick with silence, and the walls themselves seem to lean toward one side of the room. A trial is about to begin, but its outcome has already been decided long before the first witness speaks. For those who dared to take the stand, the risk was immense. Testimony offered by black witnesses was frequently dismissed outright, not because of inconsistencies or lack of evidence, but because of who the witness was. A sworn oath carried little weight if it came from certain lips. No matter how honest, no matter how detailed, words spoken in defense could be erased by a single objection from the other side or a ruling from the bench. This imbalance turned trials into performances. Prosecutors relied on prejudice as their strongest argument, painting entire communities with the brush of suspicion. Defense attorneys, when they even had the courage to speak up, knew they were fighting uphill battles. Juries, selected carefully to reflect one side of society, nodded along to the familiar narrative: guilt was assumed, innocence was nearly impossible to prove. The result was a pattern of wrongful convictions that scarred countless lives. People were sentenced not on the basis of facts but on assumptions, rumors, and deeply ingrained fears. An accusation alone could be enough to seal a fate. In some cases, evidence was fabricated or ignored; in others, confessions were coerced. The very system designed to protect fairness instead became a weapon. Courtrooms should have been sanctuaries of truth. Instead, they were places where laws bent under the weight of bias. The gavel, meant to represent authority and order, often struck down not justice but equality. Every ruling that disregarded fair testimony, every verdict reached without proper consideration, reinforced a message: some voices were not meant to be heard. This reality carried devastating consequences outside the courtroom as well. Families lived with the constant fear that a loved one could be taken away, not because of guilt, but because of the way the system operated. Communities learned that truth did not guarantee safety. Even teaching children about fairness became complicated, because how could parents speak of justice when the very courts betrayed it? And yet, within this bleak landscape, courage still surfaced. There were individuals who risked everything to testify, even knowing their words might be dismissed. There were lawyers and activists who studied the law relentlessly, searching for cracks in the system where hope might enter. Churches and local groups rallied to support families caught in the cycle, offering strength when the courts offered none. These acts of resilience did not erase the injustice, but they planted seeds of resistance that would grow over time. The imbalance in trials became one of the driving forces behind the push for civil rights. Generations of activists understood that true equality could never be achieved if the legal system remained tilted. They marched, wrote petitions, and demanded reforms, forcing the nation to confront the contradiction of a justice system that failed to deliver justice. By the mid-20th century, some changes began to take root. Laws were passed to ensure fairer jury selection, to guarantee legal representation, and to protect the right to testify. But even with these reforms, the legacy of those biased trials lingered, casting long shadows. The memory of lives destroyed by unjust convictions became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile fairness can be when prejudice is allowed to sit in the judge's chair. The story of those courtrooms is not only about the failures of the past. It is about the resilience of people who refuse to accept silence as their fate. It is about the courage to speak even when the world refuses to listen. And it is about the ongoing responsibility of every generation to guard justice carefully, to ensure that truth is never buried under bias, and that the law serves all people equally. When we remember these trials, we are reminded of a hard truth: justice is not automatic. It must be defended, protected, and nurtured. And the lessons of the past call on us to remain vigilant, to demand fairness in every courtroom, and to honor the voices that history once tried to silence. After the Civil War, a new chapter of American history began, one that was supposed to mark the end of bondage and the beginning of freedom. The 13th Amendment was celebrated as the amendment that abolished slavery. Its words seemed simple, even absolute: no one in the United States could be held as property. But buried inside that promise was a single exception, a short phrase that would alter the course of countless lives, except as a punishment for crime. That exception became a doorway. And through it, an entire system of forced labor re-emerged, not on plantations with overseers, but in prisons and work camps run by the state. The chains were no longer called slavery, but the experience was hauntingly familiar for those trapped within them. Imagine a young man walking down a dirt road in the 1880s. He has no steady job, no savings, and little opportunity. To some lawmakers, his very existence is suspicious. Police stop him and charge him with vagrancy, a vague offense that could mean anything from standing still too long to not having proof of employment. Within days, he finds himself before a judge. The trial is quick, the verdict is certain, and the sentence is brutal. Instead of serving his time in a jail cell, he is leased out to private companies, railroads, coal mines, lumber yards, and brickyards. These businesses pay the state for his labor, and in return, the state provides a steady stream of workers. For the companies, it is a perfect arrangement: cheap, disposable labor with no responsibility for the workers' lives. For the prisoners, it is a nightmare. Convict leasing became one of the most profitable industries of the post-war South. States built their economies on the backs of prisoners, many of whom had committed no real crime at all. Arrests skyrocketed, not because of rising lawlessness, but because counties and businesses demanded more labor. It was a machine fueled by human suffering, disguised as law and order. The conditions were unthinkable. Men were shackled together in long chains, forced to work from sunrise to sundown with little food and no rest. Coal mines swallowed them whole, the darkness lit only by the dim glow of lanterns, the air thick with dust that cut their lungs. In the fields, the heat scorched their backs while whips reminded them to move faster. Nights brought no comfort. They slept in overcrowded cages, bodies pressed together, the smell of sweat and iron heavy in the air. Medical care was non-existent. Injury or illness did not excuse you from work, it often sealed your fate. The numbers tell part of the story. In some states, convict leasing was so lucrative that taxpayers paid nothing to maintain prisons. The labor of prisoners, overwhelmingly black men, generated enough money to cover the costs of entire correctional systems and still turn a profit. Human lives became line items in state budgets. But the deeper story lies in the lives stolen. Families were torn apart, children left without fathers, communities hollowed by the constant threat that anyone could be taken at any time. The law, meant to protect, became a weapon used to supply industries with bodies. And yet, resistance flickered even in these darkest corners. Some prisoners found small ways to fight back, working slower, sabotaging tools, or escaping despite the deadly risks. Journalists and reformers began to expose the cruelty of the system, publishing reports and testimonies that shocked the public. Churches and activists raised their voices, demanding that this new form of exploitation be dismantled. Over time, pressure mounted. By the early 20th century, convict leasing was officially outlawed in many states. But even as the practice ended, it left behind a legacy that continues to shape the prison system today. The image of prison as a place of punishment, not rehabilitation, and the reliance on incarcerated labor did not disappear. They simply evolved. The story of the 13th Amendment loophole is not just about the past, it is about how quickly injustice can find shelter in the smallest gaps of law. It reveals how freedom can be promised on paper yet denied in practice, how profit can twist principles, and how vigilance is required to ensure that rights are not eroded by exceptions. When we look back at this chapter, it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: the journey from chains to true liberty was not a straight path. It was obstructed, rerouted, and in many ways, rewritten by those who saw opportunity in the suffering of others. And yet, remembering these stories matters. Each testimony, each record of life under convict leasing, stands as a reminder that justice must be actively protected. Freedom cannot rest on assumptions, it must be defended, clarified, and guaranteed. Because as history shows, even a single phrase in a law can change the destiny of millions. The years after World War I were supposed to be filled with hope. Thousands of black men had returned home wearing uniforms, carrying medals, and believing that their service had earned them not only respect but also a fair chance at the American dream. Communities across the country were growing, building schools, businesses, churches, and neighborhoods that shined with possibility. It seemed, for a moment, that progress was not only possible but unstoppable. But progress has always been dangerous to those who fear change. And in the summer of 1919, the promise of a new beginning was met with waves of terror that stretched across the nation. That summer would be remembered not for celebration but for violence so widespread that it earned a chilling name: the Red Summer. In cities both north and south, black veterans and families became targets. White mobs poured into neighborhoods, setting homes ablaze and attacking anyone they found in the streets. The spark for these attacks was often small: a rumor, an accusation, or simply resentment over the sight of black success. But the flames spread quickly. In Chicago, Washington, D.C., Omaha, and more than 24 other cities, the pattern repeated, destruction aimed at silencing ambition. In Chicago, the violence began with a boy named Eugene Williams. On a hot July day, he floated across an invisible racial boundary line while swimming in Lake Michigan. For that act alone, he was struck with rocks until he drowned. The police refused to arrest the attackers, and what followed was chaos. For days, the city burned. White gangs roamed the streets, pulling people from streetcars, torching homes, and clashing with residents who dared to fight back. By the time it ended, dozens were dead and hundreds injured, with black families left homeless, their communities in ruins. The Red Summer revealed a brutal truth: the end of war abroad did not mean the end of conflict at home. Black veterans, once praised for their bravery overseas, now found themselves hunted in the very country they had defended. Their pride, their uniforms, and their determination to claim dignity were treated as threats. Just 2 years later, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, another tragedy unfolded on an even more devastating scale. Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, was one of the most prosperous black communities in America. Doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and teachers thrived there, creating a neighborhood built on resilience and determination. It was proof that progress was not just possible but real. But progress painted a target. In 1921, an accusation involving a young black man and a white elevator operator ignited the spark. Headlines fanned the flames, mobs gathered, and what began as whispers of suspicion erupted into all-out destruction. Over the course of 48 hours, planes dropped incendiaries, businesses were torched, and homes were reduced to ash. Families fled, carrying only what they could hold, while others were rounded up and detained. Greenwood was left in ruins, its streets littered with rubble, its people stripped of the wealth they had spent generations building. The destruction of Tulsa was not just physical. It was psychological. It sent a clear message: no matter how successful, no matter how educated, no matter how determined, progress could be undone in a single night. Lives were lost, dreams shattered, and opportunities stolen. The trauma passed from one generation to the next, shaping how entire families and communities saw their place in a country that promised equality but delivered devastation. What connects the Red Summer and the Tulsa Massacre is not only the violence itself but the intent behind it. These events were not accidents of chaos, they were deliberate attempts to suppress progress. When black communities began to thrive, they were met with destruction. When black voices demanded justice, they were silenced with fear. And yet, out of the ashes, resilience remained. Survivors rebuilt what they could, carrying scars but also determination. The stories of these events, though buried for decades, have resurfaced in recent years, reminding us that the fight for equality has never been just about laws, it has been about survival in the face of deliberate opposition. The lesson of these tragedies is sobering but essential: progress can be fragile when it is threatened by fear and hatred. But memory itself is a form of resistance. By telling these stories, by remembering the names of places like Chicago, Washington, and Greenwood, we ensure that silence does not win. The Red Summer and the Tulsa Massacre are more than moments of destruction. They are chapters in a larger story of resilience, of communities that dared to dream despite the risks, and of the ongoing struggle to turn the promise of equality into reality. Remembering them is not only about honoring the past, it is about protecting the future. In towns and cities across America, there were schools where the sound of laughter and learning echoed, but the walls themselves told a different story. Cracked plaster, leaky roofs, hand-me-down books missing pages, and outdated maps that still showed countries which no longer existed. These were the places where many black children spent their days, not because their parents didn't care, but because the system had decided their education was worth less. Generations grew up in classrooms where teachers stretched themselves thin, teaching dozens more students than the room could hold. Chalkboards were so worn they barely held the writing, desks were wobbly, and supplies were scarce. While children across town had access to modern buildings with science labs, libraries, and music programs, black schools were expected to do the impossible with almost nothing. Yet in those classrooms, teachers poured their hearts into their work, reminding their students that knowledge was power, even if the world seemed determined to keep it from them. For a long time, separate was not just accepted, it was the law. When Brown v. Board of Education was decided in 1954, many believed it would mark the beginning of real change. The ruling declared that segregation in education was unconstitutional, a direct rejection of the old idea that, separate but equal, was acceptable. On paper, it was a monumental victory. Parents, students, and teachers celebrated, believing that soon children would no longer be divided by race, and resources would finally be shared fairly. But reality unfolded differently. In many places, integration was delayed, resisted, or outright ignored. Courts issued orders, yet local officials found ways to stall. Some districts closed entire schools rather than allow children to learn side by side. Others funneled money into private academies that were designed to exclude, leaving public schools for black children even more neglected than before. The promise of Brown was powerful, but its implementation became a battlefield. Imagine being a child in the 1960s, carrying a notebook through muddy roads to a schoolhouse with no running water, knowing that just miles away students your age were learning in shiny new buildings. That contrast was not an accident, it was the result of deliberate choices made to keep opportunity uneven. Students understood this imbalance even if they couldn't always name it. They felt it when they studied by candlelight because their school had no electricity, or when they had to share a single textbook among several classmates. And yet, something remarkable persisted. In the face of underfunding and neglect, black schools often became places of resilience. Teachers acted not only as educators but as mentors, role models, and community leaders. They taught more than math and reading, they instilled pride, discipline, and hope. They reminded their students that even if the system tried to deny them opportunity, their minds were capable of greatness. Still, the inequality carried lasting consequences. Generations left those schools underprepared, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked access to the same tools and resources afforded to others. This gap rippled forward, shaping careers, incomes, and opportunities for families long after they left the classroom. Even decades after Brown v. Board, many schools remain divided, not by law, but by housing patterns, funding formulas, and policies that ensured some communities received more while others struggled with less. The story of education under segregation is not just about buildings and budgets. It is about a promise broken over and over again. A promise that every child, no matter their background, deserves a fair chance to learn, to grow, to dream. When that promise was denied, entire communities carried the weight. And yet, even within that struggle, there is a story of perseverance. Students from those neglected schools went on to become leaders, artists, scientists, and activists. They carried with them the memory of teachers who refused to give up and communities that sacrificed so their children could at least have something. Their success was not because the system supported them, but because they fought through barriers that should never have been there in the first place. Looking back, it's clear that the fight for equal education was never just about classrooms. It was about dignity, about fairness, about whether a society would recognize the full humanity of all its children. The crumbling schools, the missing books, the broken promises, they were never just inconveniences. They were reminders of a deeper struggle, one that continues in different forms even today. The lesson is this: education shapes the future of a nation. When it is denied to some, the entire society suffers. But when it is given fairly and fully, it becomes the foundation for progress. The story of those neglected schools is painful, but it is also a call to remember that equality cannot just be declared in a courtroom, it must be built, day by day, in every classroom, for every child. For decades, fear was stitched into the daily lives of countless families. It wasn't just the threat of violence, it was the spectacle of it. Gatherings where cruelty replaced justice, where entire crowds treated human suffering as an event, left behind scars deeper than any physical wound. These were not hidden acts, they were public declarations, designed to remind black communities that no matter how hard they worked, how much they achieved, or how deeply they loved their families, the shadow of terror was never far away. Parents raised their children under this cloud, knowing that something as small as a glance, a word, or simply being in the wrong place could trigger unthinkable consequences. The message was clear: fear was meant to be inherited, passed down from one generation to the next. And for those who lived through it, the silence of the law was just as devastating as the violence itself. For far too long, officials looked away, and justice never came. Yet even in the midst of this darkness, there was resilience. Communities mourned their losses, but they also found ways to hold on to faith and hope. They sang songs that carried hidden messages of survival. They told stories that reminded the next generation of strength. And they marched, prayed, and spoke out, even when the risks were unbearable. Every act of courage chipped away at the culture of silence, slowly but surely forcing the nation to confront what it wanted to ignore. It wasn't until very recently, shockingly recently, that the United States officially outlawed lynching as a federal crime, with the passage of the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in 2022. Think about that, nearly 150 years after the end of slavery, it took until the 21st century for the country to clearly declare that such acts were crimes against its people. That fact alone tells us how deeply rooted the struggle has been, and how determined those who resisted had to be. This final chapter is not only about tragedy but also about remembrance. By telling these stories, we ensure that the cruelty of the past is not forgotten and that the silence which once surrounded it is broken forever. Memory becomes a form of justice. Every time we speak these truths, we deny the past the power of erasure. Every time we honor those who were lost, we remind ourselves that their lives mattered, that their dreams were real, and that their futures were stolen. As we reflect on this painful history, we also recognize the courage it took for so many to endure and resist. Their determination paved the way for civil rights victories, for new conversations about justice, and for a continuing demand that equality be more than just words on paper. Their legacy is not only the struggle they faced but the progress their resilience made possible. So as we close this chapter, let us carry with us both the weight of history and the light of remembrance. Let us recognize the progress that has been made, while also understanding how much more is left to do. And most importantly, let us honor the strength of those who refuse to be silenced by fear. If you found this story meaningful, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more untold history, and sharing it with others who need to hear these truths. Together, we can keep these stories alive and ensure they guide us toward a more just future. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. May you carry these lessons with you, and may your evening be peaceful. Good night, everyone.